War films are often sold as spectacle heroism and victory. But some films went further. They showed confusion, fear, failure, and the human cost that veterans recognized immediately. These British war films did not cause panic because they were offensive. They caused panic because they were accurate. Officials hesitated, censors interfered, and broadcasts were restricted, not because they lied, but because they told the truth too clearly. Number 12. Threads, 1984. When Threads aired on British television in 1984, it did not merely disturb audiences. It triggered outright institutional panic. Councils reportedly fielded calls from frightened viewers. Schools quietly stopped recommending it. The BBC received complaints demanding it never be repeated. For years, it effectively vanished from primetime not through an official ban, but through collective unease. This was a war film that did not feel like fiction, and that was the problem. Set in Sheffield and structured like a civil defense report rather than a drama. Thread strips nuclear war of every comforting abstraction. There are no heroic leaders, no last-minute rescues, no emotional release. The film tracks ordinary people as global tensions escalate, then detonates their lives with clinical indifference. The infamous narration explains radiation, sickness, crop failure, and social collapse with the tone of an instructional manual. That coldness is what made it unbearable. It felt less like entertainment and more like a warning that slipped through the cracks. Veterans and military planners have long pointed out why Threads hit so hard. Its depiction of command breakdown, misinformation, and the total inadequacy of civil defense measures aligns closely with Cold War contingency assessments. Former RAF and Army personnel have noted that the film accurately reflects how quickly communication would fail, how untrained civilians would be left to improvise, and how survival would become brutally local. The horror comes not from spectacle, but from logistics. Food distribution collapses, medical care becomes meaningless, and authority loses relevance. The panic around Threads was not about violence, it was about plausibility. Unlike American nuclear films that soften the blow with symbolism or optimism, Threads insisted on consequences that stretched decades into the future. Children grow up, feral literacy collapses, and England regresses into something unrecognizable. That was too close to policies papers officials preferred to keep theoretical. Today, Threads is often cited by veterans and historians as the most honest screen depiction of nuclear war ever produced in Britain. Its unofficial suppression only strengthened its reputation. This was not banned because it was inaccurate. It was quietly buried because it was devastatingly correct. Number 11. Went the Day. Well, 1942, released in the middle of the Second World War, went the day well. Caused a very different kind of panic. This was a film made for wartime Britain, yet it unsettled the very people it was meant to reassure. Based on a Graham Greene story, the film depicts a quiet English village infiltrated by German paratroopers, disguised as British soldiers. The invasion does not come with fanfare. It arrives politely. Yes, that alone was enough to alarm authorities. Local councils and some cinemas hesitated to screen it. There were concerns it revealed vulnerabilities on the home front. The idea that the enemy could blend in, exploit trust, and massacre civilians ran counter to morale-building narratives. In some regions, the film was effectively pulled or quietly sidelined. It was not officially banned, but it was certainly discouraged. Veterans have long defended the film's realism. Home Guard members and later territorial soldiers noted that the film accurately portrayed confusion, hesitation, and the terrifying speed at which a small, organized force could overwhelm unprepared civilians. There are no romantic last stands here. People die abruptly, sometimes mid-sentence. Acts of bravery are small, desperate, and often futile. What particularly resonated with veterans was the film's understanding of fear. The village does not instantly unite. People argue, doubt each other, and make fatal assumptions. Authority figures are compromised early. Communication breaks down. This mirrors countless real accounts from occupied Europe and later conflicts. War does not announce itself. It exploits routine. The panic surrounding "Went the Day Well" stemmed from its implications. If this could happen on screen, it could happen in reality. The film suggested that victory depended not just on armies abroad, but on vigilance at home. That was an uncomfortable message during a time when the public was already stretched thin. Decades later, the film is praised as one of Britain's most honest wartime productions. Veterans respect it because it refuses comfort. It shows war as intrusion, betrayal, and sudden loss. Its early suppression only confirms how close it came to the truth. Number 10. The Hill, 1965. When The Hill premiered in 1965, it ignited panic of a quieter but more institutional kind. This was not a battlefield epic. It was a prison film set inside a British military detention camp in North Africa during the Second World War. Yet the reaction from military authorities was immediate and defensive. Here was a film suggesting that cruelty, brutality, and pointless punishment could exist inside the British Army itself. That implication was explosive. The film focuses on 5 soldiers serving sentences under a sadistic regime enforced by a careerist sergeant, played with chilling restraint. There are no enemy forces, no combat heroics, no external threat. The enemy is authority weaponized against its own men. The infamous punishment detail forcing prisoners to repeatedly climb a man-made sand hill under the desert sun became a symbol of institutional sadism. That image alone was enough to make officials deeply uncomfortable. While not officially banned, the hill faced resistance in promotion and exhibition. It was viewed as damaging to Britain's carefully maintained image of moral superiority. The timing mattered. The mid-1960s saw the armed forces struggling with recruitment and public confidence. A film portraying soldiers broken by their own system was seen as corrosive. Veterans, however, recognized the truth immediately. Former servicemen, especially those who had experienced military prisons or disciplinary units, spoke openly about the film's accuracy. The arbitrary rules, the obsession with appearances, the way punishment became an end in itself, all rang painfully true. What the film captured was not sadism for its own sake, but bureaucracy unchecked by empathy. What truly alarmed institutions was the film's refusal to offer redemption. There is no noble reform, no cleansing victory. Even acts of resistance are ambiguous and costly. The system grinds on largely unchanged. That realism cut against decades of cinematic tradition where military authority was ultimately justified. The Hill did not attack the idea of service. It attacked the idea that suffering automatically produces discipline or honor. Veterans respected it for making that distinction. It showed that morale is not built through fear, and that obedience enforced through humiliation breeds resentment, not strength. The panic around the Hill was rooted in exposure. It forced audiences to confront the possibility that injustice could be internal rather than external. That truth made it one of the most quietly subversive war films Britain ever produced. Number 9. The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, 1943. Few British war films caused panic at the highest levels of government quite like The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp. Released in 1943 at the height of the Second World War, the film was actively opposed by Winston Churchill himself. He attempted to block its production, distribution, and overseas release. That level of intervention reveals just how threatening its message was perceived to be. On the surface, the film appears gentle, even nostalgic. Or it follows the life of a British officer across decades, tracing his rise, his friendships, and his gradual obsolescence. But beneath that warmth lies a devastating critique. The film suggests that the values which once defined honorable warfare had become liabilities in a modern total war. Worse, it implies that clinging to outdated notions of gentlemanly conduct could cost lives. Churchill objected fiercely. He believed the film undermined morale and portrayed British leadership as slow, inflexible, and sentimental. The idea that a respected officer could become irrelevant or misguided during wartime was unacceptable. As a result, the film was denied full wartime distribution in some territories and was kept out of American cinemas for years. Veterans, however, saw something very different. Like many officers recognized themselves in Colonel Blimp not as caricature, but as cautionary figure. The film acknowledged the emotional cost of service, the loneliness of command, and the pain of watching one's principles age out of relevance. It respected soldiers by treating them as thinking, feeling individuals rather than symbols. What made the film so dangerous was its honesty about change. It did not accuse soldiers of failure. It accused institutions of refusing to adapt. That message during an existential war felt like heresy. Yet veterans later argued that this was precisely why the film mattered. It understood that war is not static, and that moral certainty can become a trap. Over time, The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp came to be seen as one of Britain's greatest war films. Its early suppression now reads as proof of its insight. It was not wrong. It was simply too honest at a moment when honesty felt risky. Number 8. Oh, What a Lovely War, 1969. When Oh, What a Lovely War arrived in 1969, it detonated a different kind of panic. This was not fear rooted in invasion or discipline or national security. This was cultural panic. Richard Attenborough's film took the First World War and stripped it of reverence, then presented the carnage as bitter theater. Generals were reduced to figures on elevated platforms, while casualty numbers ticked upward like accounting errors. For many, institutions that approach felt close to treason. The film's satirical musical framing made it even more dangerous. Patriotic songs were repurposed into weapons of irony. Cheerful melodies accompanied statistics of mass death. This tonal dissonance disturbed audiences who had grown up with sanitized heroic narratives. Broadcasters and educators were uneasy. In some territories and venues, the film was limited or discouraged due to fears it would undermine respect for the armed forces. Veterans' reactions were sharply divided at first. Some bristled at the presentation. Others immediately recognized its core truth. Former infantrymen from both world wars later defended the film for exposing the machinery that fed men into futile offensives. The film does not mock soldiers. It indicts decision-making that treated lives as expendable resources. That distinction mattered deeply to those who had served. What unsettled authorities was how clearly the film connected leadership detachment to slaughter. Officers dine comfortably, while men die in mud. Promotions continue as bodies pile up. The implication is not subtle. War was not just tragic, it was mismanaged. In an era still shaped by post-war deference, that message felt destabilizing. The panic also stemmed from timing. Released during the Vietnam War, and amid widespread youth unrest, the film became a lightning rod. Its imagery was easily repurposed as protest material. Institutions feared it would fuel anti-war sentiment at home. In that sense, its suppression was about control, not accuracy. Today, veterans who speak positively of the film often highlight its emotional honesty. It captures exhaustion, cynicism, and the sense of being trapped in a system too large to challenge. While stylized, the emotional truth resonates strongly. Oh, what a lovely war did not get banned because it lied. Or it caused panic because it reframed sacrifice as something demanded, not chosen. Number 7. Aces High, 1976. Aces High arrived in 1976 and unsettled audiences expecting another rousing aviation adventure. Instead, they were given a film steeped in dread inevitability and psychological erosion. Set during the First World War, it follows young pilots cycling through combat units, where death is routine and survival feels temporary. The panic surrounding the film came from its refusal to romanticize air combat. At a time when flying aces were still widely portrayed as glamorous heroes, Aces High dismantled the myth. Pilots drink heavily, mock death, and wait for their turn to be erased. Commanders know the odds and say nothing. Aircraft are unreliable, and training is inadequate. Death comes suddenly, often without meaning. Yet for institutions invested in heroic aviation lore, this was deeply uncomfortable. While not formally banned, the film struggled with distribution and promotion. It did not fit the mold of inspirational war cinema. Its bleak tone and nihilistic undercurrent made broadcasters hesitant. This was a war film that suggested courage did not guarantee survival, and skill did not equal control. That message challenged decades of myth-making. Veterans, particularly those from air forces, responded with recognition rather than outrage. Former RAF personnel have pointed out that the film captures the psychological attrition of combat flying with rare accuracy. The constant tension, the gallows humor, and the sense of being already dead align closely with memoirs from multiple conflicts. The film understands that fear does not disappear with experience. It accumulates. What truly sparked panic was the film's treatment of command. Senior officers are not villains, but they are complicit. They rotate men into combat knowing most will not return. The system persists because it must. That fatalism mirrored veterans' lived experience more than official narratives ever did. Aces High ends without triumph. There is no cleansing victory, no moral uplift. War simply consumes another generation. That bleak honesty limited its initial acceptance, but cemented its credibility among those who had served. Over time, it gained respect as one of the few British war films willing to show air combat as attritional rather than glorious. Its early marginalization now reads as avoidance. The film did not panic audiences with spectacle. It panicked institutions by exposing the emotional cost behind the medals. Number 6. Battle of the River Plate, 1956. At first glance, Battle of the River Plate appears to be one of the safest war films Britain ever produced. It is procedural, restrained, and rooted in naval tradition, yet beneath that surface calm, the film caused quiet panic within diplomatic and military circles. The reason was not spectacle, but precision. This film portrayed modern naval warfare with a level of tactical clarity that made officials uneasy during the early Cold War. The story recounts the pursuit of the German pocket battleship Graf Spee by British cruisers in the South Atlantic. Rather than exaggerating heroism, the film focuses on decision-making, logistics, and restraint. Commanders hesitate, calculate, and sometimes withdraw. The victory is not achieved through overwhelming force, but through pressure, misinformation, and psychology. That approach clashed with the more triumphant narratives Britain preferred to export. Concerns emerged about how the enemy was depicted. The German captain is shown as intelligent, principled, and humane. He cares deeply about his crew and ultimately chooses to scuttle his ship to avoid pointless loss of life. For some officials, this felt dangerously close to empathy. During a period when wartime memory was still politically sensitive, portraying an enemy commander with dignity sparked discomfort. Edits were requested in certain markets, and the film's circulation was carefully managed. The fear was that it complicated the moral clarity of the war, at a time when Britain needed simple narratives for both domestic confidence and international positioning. This was not a film about annihilating the enemy. It was about stalemate pressure and consequence. The veterans, particularly from naval backgrounds, responded positively. Former sailors praised the accuracy of ship-handling communications, protocols, and command hierarchy. The film captures the tension of waiting hours for contact, the boredom punctuated by sudden danger, and the responsibility of command when every decision risks hundreds of lives. These were experiences rarely depicted with such restraint. What caused panic was the film's implication that modern war is not won through bravado, but through calculation. That lesson carried uncomfortable relevance for Cold War strategists. It suggested that escalation was not inevitable and that restraint could be decisive. Those ideas did not sit easily with deterrence rhetoric. Over time, Battle of the River Plate became respected for its authenticity. Veterans saw it as honest about naval warfare's slow, grinding pressure. Its early sensitivity was not about inaccuracy, but about the power of realism to complicate official narratives. Number 5. Dunkirk, 1958. Before the evacuation of Dunkirk was mythologized as a near miracle, Dunkirk in 1958 offered a far more sobering portrayal. The film arrived during a period when Britain was still shaping its post-war identity, and the reaction was cautious, bordering on anxious. This was not a triumphant retreat. It was a depiction of confusion, exhaustion, and improvisation on the edge of collapse. The film splits its focus between soldiers stranded on the beaches and civilians crossing the channel in small boats. What unsettled audiences was the lack of heroic framing. Soldiers are frightened, hungry, and directionless. Orders are unclear. The retreat feels less like strategy and more like survival. There is no swelling music, no cathartic victory. Escape is the only goal. Some broadcasters and commentators worried the film undercut morale by presenting Dunkirk as chaos rather than legend. Screenings were handled carefully, and the film did not receive the celebratory positioning later depictions enjoyed. The fear was that it stripped away the comforting narrative Britain had begun to build around the event. Veterans responded differently. Many who had been there, or served shortly after, recognized the truth. The film captures the emotional reality of waiting under fire, not knowing if rescue will come. The small boat sequences in particular resonated. Civilian volunteers are brave but terrified. They make mistakes. Their courage is quiet and unpolished. What caused institutional panic was the film's insistence that survival was not the same as victory. It showed that morale was preserved not through triumph, but through endurance. That distinction challenged simplified national myths. The film suggested that Britain's strength lay in persistence rather than dominance. Importantly, the film avoids demonizing the enemy. German forces are largely unseen, represented through artillery and aircraft. The threat is impersonal, relentless, and efficient. This mirrors veterans' recollections far more closely than personalized villains ever could. Over time, Dunkirk earned respect as one of the most grounded portrayals of the evacuation. Veterans praised its restraint and honesty. Its initial unease stemmed from timing. Britain was not yet ready to see Dunkirk as it truly was. The film arrived too early for comfort, but exactly on time for truth. Number 4. Zulu, 1964. Zulu is often remembered today as a rousing epic of discipline, endurance, and battlefield courage. What is less remembered is how much institutional anxiety surrounded its release in 1964. At a time when Britain was reassessing its imperial past, the film reopened wounds many preferred to keep sealed. The panic did not come from violence alone. It came from context. Depicting the Battle of Rorke's Drift, the film focuses on a small British garrison holding out against overwhelming Zulu forces. On the surface, this appears to reinforce traditional narratives of British resolve, but the film's refusal to portray the Zulu warriors as mindless aggressors complicated matters. They are organized, strategic, and formidable. Their discipline mirrors that of the British soldiers. That symmetry unsettled audiences accustomed to colonial simplifications. There were concerns about how the film would be received internationally, particularly in newly independent African nations. Scenes of massed Zulu attacks combined with the Union Jack imagery raised fears of glorifying colonial violence. Certain sequences were trimmed or scrutinized closely in different territories. The panic was diplomatic as much as cultural. The veterans' reactions were notably grounded. Many former soldiers praised the film's depiction of defensive warfare logistics and unit cohesion. The exhaustion, the repetition of firing and reloading, and the reliance on drill rather than bravado felt authentic. Veterans often point out that the film understands boredom, fear, and routine as much as heroism. What caused deeper discomfort was the film's subtext. The British victory comes at enormous cost and offers no strategic gain. The soldiers survive, but the empire does not emerge vindicated. The Zulu salute at the end reframes the battle as mutual recognition rather than domination. That moment alone sparked debate. Some saw respect, others saw unease. Institutions struggled with that ambiguity. Zulu neither condemns nor celebrates empire outright. It simply presents an encounter shaped by history, power, and circumstance. That refusal to editorialize was risky. It left audiences to draw their own conclusions. Over time, veterans have defended Zulu, not as propaganda, but as a study of soldiering under pressure. The panic around its release reflected Britain's anxiety about its past, rather than the film's content. Zulu endured because it treated combatants as professionals rather than symbols. Number 3, In Which We Serve, 1942. During the height of the Second World War, In Which We Serve was expected to be straightforward morale-boosting cinema. Instead, it generated quiet panic within government circles, precisely because it was too emotionally honest. Co-directed by Noel Coward and David Lean, the film follows the crew of a Royal Navy destroyer through combat loss and survival. What unsettled officials was not defeat, but intimacy. The film spends as much time in memory as it does in battle. Sailors recall wives' arguments, children, and ordinary routines. Rank dissolves in moments of crisis. Officers and ratings float together in the wreckage. This humanization ran counter to the stiff upper lip ideal Britain relied upon for wartime messaging. There were concerns that showing grief, doubt, and fear might weaken resolve. Some officials questioned whether such vulnerability belonged on screen during an active war. Distribution was carefully handled, and the film's framing as tribute rather than critique was emphasized heavily. Veterans, however, responded powerfully. Naval servicemen recognized the rhythms immediately. The cramped spaces, the rituals, the sudden violence, and the long stretches of waiting felt exact. The film captures the strange democracy of survival at sea, where rank matters until it suddenly does not. What caused panic was the film's suggestion that endurance comes from connection, not abstraction. Sailors fight not for slogans, but for each other. Loss is not noble, it is personal and disorienting. That message risked undermining simplified patriotic narratives. Importantly, the film does not question the necessity of the war. It questions the cost. That distinction made it both dangerous and enduring. Veterans respected it because it did not deny fear. It treated courage as something practiced daily rather than proclaimed. In Which We Serve remains one of the most respected British war films precisely because it trusted audiences with emotional truth. Its early sensitivity was not about dissent. It was about acknowledging that war is carried by people, not ideals. That honesty caused unease then, and earns respect now. Number 2, The Charge of the Light Brigade, 1936. By the standards of its era, the Charge of the Light Brigade should have been a safe patriotic spectacle. Instead, it generated deep unease that lingered long after its release. The panic was subtle but persistent, because the film reopened one of Britain's most uncomfortable military episodes and refused to fully resolve it. At its core lay a devastating implication. Courage was abundant, leadership was not. The film dramatizes the Crimean War and the infamous charge born of miscommunication, arrogance, and rigid hierarchy. While wrapped in pageantry, the narrative never escapes the shadow of futility. Soldiers ride forward with unquestioning bravery, while commanders argue, misinterpret orders, and preserve their pride. The result is slaughter without strategic gain. For institutions built on obedience, that message was unsettling. Although the film predates the Second World War, its reputation became increasingly sensitive as Europe moved toward another conflict. The idea that loyalty and discipline could be exploited by incompetence ran counter to the unity Britain needed to project. As a result, the film's circulation and framing were treated carefully. It was celebrated for spectacle while its implications were quietly downplayed. Veterans later responded with a more measured respect. Cavalrymen and infantry alike recognized the dynamic instantly. Orders are obeyed because refusal is unthinkable. The film captures the psychological bind of soldiers trained to act, not question. That realism resonated strongly with those who had lived under rigid command structures. What caused panic was not the battle itself, but the accountability vacuum it exposed. The film suggests that failure at the top rarely carries the same consequences as failure at the bottom. Soldiers die, careers survive. That truth echoed uncomfortably across decades of military history. The charge of the Light Brigade also challenged romantic fatalism. It did not portray death as glorious. It portrayed it as inevitable once momentum replaced judgment. The soldiers are not naive. They are loyal. That distinction matters. Veterans have often defended the film for honoring courage while condemning recklessness. Over time, the film's reputation shifted from patriotic epic to cautionary tale. Its early unease stemmed from timing and implication. It reminded Britain that bravery cannot compensate for flawed leadership. That lesson never loses relevance. The film endured because it respected soldiers enough to show how easily they can be sacrificed by tradition and pride. Number 1. One of our aircraft is missing, 1942. At the top of the panic scale sits One of Our Aircraft is Missing, a film whose quiet realism made it unexpectedly dangerous during wartime Britain. Released in 1942, the film follows a Royal Air Force bomber crew shot down over occupied Netherlands. What caused alarm was not defeat, but exposure. This film showed what happened after the mission failed. Unlike many wartime productions, the story does not rush toward heroics. The crew scatters, survives, and relies entirely on civilians to escape. Dutch resistance members risk execution to hide them. There is no triumphant counterattack. Survival depends on trust, patience, and silence. The film treats war as a network of ordinary people rather than a clash of symbols. Authorities worried about several things at once. The film revealed resistance tactics too plainly. It showed how downed airmen were hidden, fed, and moved. There were concerns this information could aid the enemy. Some markets received edited versions, and the film's distribution was handled cautiously despite its propaganda value. Veterans later argued that this realism was precisely its strength. ORAF personnel recognized the procedures immediately. The confusion after being shot down, the dependence on strangers, and the emotional strain of waiting felt exact. The film captures how helpless trained airmen become once isolated. Rank evaporates. Survival becomes collective. What truly unsettled institutions was the film's moral center. The heroes are not just the airmen, but the civilians. Ordinary shopkeepers, farmers, and families shoulder the real risk. This shifted the narrative of sacrifice away from uniforms alone. That was politically delicate. It suggested that war's burden was shared unevenly and often invisibly. The film also avoided demonization. German forces are present, but not caricatured. The real threat is occupation itself. Surveillance, fear, and betrayal loom constantly. Though veterans have praised this restraint, noting that it mirrors lived experience far more closely than exaggerated villainy. One of Our Aircraft is Missing caused panic because it stripped war of spectacle and replaced it with dependence. It showed that survival often rests on civilians who receive no medals. That truth was dangerous to broadcast widely during an active conflict. Decades later, the film is respected for its honesty. Veterans value it because it acknowledges vulnerability without diminishing courage. Its early suppression stands as proof that realism can be as threatening as dissent. What unites these films is not controversy for its own sake, it is credibility. Veterans respected them because they recognized themselves on screen, the fear, the waiting, the mistakes, and the quiet courage. These films survive suppression because truth has endurance, and once seen, it cannot be comfortably unseen.